father would tell his little girl, "Mommy is sleeping." Well, Mommy would never be seen again. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of DiAnne Keidel. Viewer discretion is advised. DiAnne Keidel was actually born DiAnne Kidder, and she was born in Peoria, Illinois on April 19th, 1935. And I believe she grew up with one sibling, a brother. DiAnne's father owned this little grocery store or convenience type store in Peoria, Illinois, and eventually DiAnne would end up working there. At some point, DiAnne did have a husband and they had one child together, but that marriage would end in divorce. By 1956, her daughter is 2 years old. DiAnne is still working at the grocery store when in comes a customer named Eugene Keidel. They had a conversation. She thought that he was charming, he was sweet, he was good looking. Eventually, they would end up dating, which would then lead to marriage. And then that led to 3 more children for DiAnne. After they were married, they would end up picking up and leaving Illinois and going out to Phoenix, Arizona, my neck of the woods, to live. They purchased a little home there in Phoenix. But by 1966, the relationship between DiAnne and Gene was not exactly great. Their marriage was essentially crumbling. And so it got to a point where Gene ends up moving out of the house and leaving DiAnne there with the 4 kids. On September 16th, 1966, DiAnne and Gene would meet for, an early dinner, and the two of them were going to be discussing how they were going to divvy up, the property and stuff like that, and maybe talk about the custody of the kids because they were probably going to be getting a divorce. Now, according to Gene, after their meeting, DiAnne would drop Gene off at the apartment he had rented after moving out of the house, and DiAnne was going to another date. She had been dating a guy for, a couple of dates, and she went to go meet him. DiAnne and this man would go out and they had a drink that night. Gene would later say that while DiAnne was supposedly out on this date with this guy, Gene would call the house to talk to the kids to make sure they were okay. He calls back a little bit later to check on the kids again, and when the kids answer, they say, "Well, Mommy still hasn't gotten home yet." So he drives out to the house himself, and then he goes into the house to take care of the kids, waiting for DiAnne to come home. Gene ends up falling asleep, and he notices that DiAnne is still not home. After he searches the house, he calls a couple of people. He then calls police to report DiAnne missing. When police arrive at the scene, they notice something kind of unusual because, Gene had said that she went out on this date and never would have come home. She never came home that night, according to him. Well, the thing is her car was actually parked in the driveway of the house. And when they looked inside the home, they found DiAnne's purse and her wallet and all of her belongings. They found Gene's story to be a little suspicious. They actually tried to reach out to the man that went out on a date with DiAnne. However, in a kind of unbelievable turn of events, that man, the day after they were supposed to have this dinner or drink date, that man died of a heart attack. And so whatever he may have known, whether or not he actually met up with DiAnne that night, will never be known for sure because he died before police even realized DiAnne was missing. It doesn't sound like they were really ever able to corroborate that DiAnne had gone out to this drink. This is in the 60s. They didn't have cell phone data and stuff like that and couldn't track a person's movements and whereabouts. And I don't think there was any indications in her bank account that she had purchased any drinks or anything like that. I'm not sure if they looked into the guy, whether or not he had purchased drinks at a whatever certain place, but it just seems unknown that drink date ever even happened at all. They don't really know. Fast forwarding to January of 1967, Gene is now back living in the house with the 4 kids because DiAnne's gone. Well, on that January day, 1967, Eugene leaves the house to go to the laundromat. On his way back home in his car, he realizes he sees several fire engines, and he's basically right behind them, and he doesn't really realize that they're actually going to his home because someone had called in a fire at his house. So by the time Gene gets there, There he sees fire trucks outside the house of his home, and they're trying to put out the fire, and they're pulling people out of the house. His 4 kids were in that house when the fire started. 2 of them came out alive. The other 2, unfortunately, did not. 5-year-old Lori had at one point walked out of the house and went back inside to get her teddy bear. And when she went back inside, her older sister, her name was Susie, went back in after Lori to go get her. But then when she went back in there, the fire had gotten worse. And so the 2 girls were essentially trapped. Susie ends up lying on top of her sister, of her little 5-year-old sister, and covering her up, telling her she loves her, how much, live a good life, that kind of thing. Because essentially what was happening was that Susie was now being ravaged by fire while she was protecting her 5-year-old sister. Susie sacrificed her life to protect her kid sister. Lori would be pulled from the fire. She did have very severe burns, and she was in a hospital for 4 months with those 3rd-degree burns. But her 12-year-old sister, Susie, perished in the fire, as well as her 8-year-old sister, Kelly, also died in the fire. Lori's brother, Gregory, also survived. When it was all said and done, investigators discovered that the fire likely originated on the stovetop. They found like a melted pot. And once police got involved with this, they knew that, this is also the house of a missing woman. DiAnne Keidel has been missing from this house for months now. And they found out that Gene was not in the house when the fire started. He was conveniently away from it, and he conveniently arrived at the scene with the fire trucks. However, unbelievably, despite all of this, despite the very bizarre circumstances around the fire and, a missing wife and mother, they never really investigated this truly as an arson. I think there were people who believed it was likely suspicious, that the fire was probably deliberately set. For what exact reason? Was it to kill all of the kids? It's not really known because no one investigated it as a criminal act. They kind of just said, must have been an accident, or we just don't have time to deal with this kind of thing. Then a couple of decades go by. Lori is now a full-grown adult. She goes to get her siblings' death certificates, and so Lori this entire time has been told that the fire was started accidentally. However, she sees on the death certificates of her 2 siblings that they died from arson. So she finds out that they did actually think this was arson, but they did nothing about it. Then Lori basically she remembers something. She's haunted by what they say was, what she describes as like a vision of what happened the night her mother disappeared. And she wrote a letter starting with, "To whom it may concern, I need to convey to authorities what I witnessed as a child. First, I must greatly express the fear I have of my father's violent retaliation. I was often told when I was a child by my father, I brought you into this world, I can take you out. He also told me that if I didn't live with him, I'd have to live in jail for children. I had countless beatings from this man when I was a child, and he has made violent attempts on me since I became an adult. I was often woken at night by my parents fighting, and my older sister would take all of the children to her room. We'd all hide in the closet. I woke one night late. They were yelling, her parents. I walked to the end of the hall and I watched Dad yelling at Mom. He then hit her. He threw her to the ground. He began swinging wildly. My mom saw me and yelled, 'Go back to bed, go back to bed.' She basically then sees her father hit her mother a few more times. Then she expresses in the letter that her next memory of her mother is seeing her mother lying on the pool deck outside in their backyard. She witnessed her father digging a hole in the dirt. Later, Lori would ask her father, what was happening with Mommy? And he said, Mommy is sleeping. Mommy's going to be sleeping for a little while. Don't worry about it. And then he tells Lori and her brother, do not ever go in that backyard again. Don't ever play back there. Lori actually asked her dad, can I dig a hole so that Mommy could breathe, so that Mommy could eat? He said no. Again, she was 5 years old when this happened. She then witnesses her father, Gene, pour concrete over the location where Mommy was supposedly sleeping. Her father would threaten her, if you say anything, if you do anything, I will hurt you, I will kill you. He did beat her on several occasions. She was petrified of her father. And it wouldn't be until the early 90s when she finally kind of had this sort of vision of all of this kind of coming back to her, when she's remembering all of this stuff. And that's when she writes that letter. And she encourages police in Phoenix to please go to that property, because now the house has been owned by someone else. Gene had sold it years prior. Gene had actually moved away, he remarried, and he's just kind of off doing his own thing. They end up bringing in ground-penetrating radar to kind of search that pool deck area, because it is completely covered in cement. Lori walks to them and tells them, this is exactly where I saw my father, burying my mom, essentially. And it's in that exact location, using the ground-penetrating radar, they find an anomaly. And so with the homeowner's permission, who's now living there, they are allowed to dig into the concrete. And so they remove all of the concrete, and less than, or about 10 inches beneath where the concrete has poured, they found a skeleton. They found the body of a person kind of lying almost in a fetal position. And the body was wearing clothes that were indicative of being from the era of the 60s, and they found a stocking or some kind of pantyhose around this skeleton's neck, indicating that that person likely died from some sort of strangulation. The skeletal remains did not have, and they had no way of obtaining any DNA from it, because again, this is the early 90s. And I don't think they had an accurate representation of DiAnne's, dental records. So they would get her dental records, but because the skeletal remains were still pretty damaged, it was kind of hard to truly identify her that way. They would also use things like where they would take her image and put it over an image of the skull. And after some time, it took them a while, but they were finally able to positively identify the body found buried in the backyard as DiAnne Keidel. Based on the state of the remains, based on the soil samples and all this, they were able to determine that body had been in there since the 60s, which would line up with the 1966 disappearance of DiAnne Keidel. Gene Keidel, who again had been remarried, had been tracked down. He was still alive. And they brought him in for questioning. He denied having anything to do with his wife's murder, but they had enough evidence to finally arrest him and charge him with the murder of DiAnne Keidel. He was officially charged in September of 1994. He goes on trial in early 1995. And despite maintaining his innocence the entire trial, in 1995, Eugene Keidel was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Unbelievably, he still had control of the cemetery plots of his two deceased children, and he refused to surrender those plots to Lori because she wants to now bury her two siblings with their mother, which is the right thing to do. But he was adamant. He said, nope, I'm not giving you any control. But thankfully, in December of 2004, yes, I said thankfully, the man died in prison. And at that point, Lori was then able to regain control of her siblings' burial plots, and she was able to reunite her siblings with her mother. Now, what about the fire? What about the two deceased children? Well, through Lori's own kind of investigating, she determined that they did list her siblings' death as being related to arson. However, she discovered there was no true arson investigation. It would be later found out that someone reported that there was traces of an accelerant used in this fire, meaning they were able to, at some point, confirm that this fire was likely deliberately set. Someone had started this fire on purpose. The only person who had motive to do that was Gene Keidel. And the assumption is because Lori was in that house and he knew that she knew that her mom was dead or sleeping. And so perhaps he did not want to run the risk of her ratting him out or telling the siblings and then them joining together eventually and ratting him out. And so maybe the plan was just to kill all the kids to get rid of them. I mean, the timing of it was just months after DiAnne went missing or, eventually found out to have been murdered. But because arson investigators, but because police department and the fire department did not really investigate this as an arson, even though they labeled it one, justice never came. It is believed that the 2 children who died in that fire died from homicide, that someone set this fire, and so they were killed because of that fire that was deliberately set. And it is believed that Gene Keidel started that fire with the purpose of killing his kids. But justice for them would never come because they didn't do anything about it for years and years and years and years. Now, eventually, Lori would sue the Phoenix Fire Department for basically wrongdoing, for not investigating this. This was not a criminal case against them. This was a civil case against them, and Lori would end up winning that case against the Phoenix Fire Department. And she would be awarded a few $1 million, basically, for this verdict. And so that's about the only justice she'll probably ever get for her siblings. I mean, her dad is dead, so they can't charge him or prosecute him for their murders. You know, the only thing she could be thankful for now is that he is dead. And that, you know, in some way, there is that kind of justice, that her siblings did get some justice because he did go to prison eventually. I mean, it took decades, and then he died there. He died alone in a prison cell. And in terms of why police didn't really thoroughly investigate him for DiAnne's disappearance, kind of the same thing. It's like they kind of knew it. They thought he had something to do with it, but they didn't have the proof. And you do need the proof. They had no body. Again, this is in the 60s. No body prosecutions were not a thing. You needed evidence. And unfortunately, they just didn't have any. They had their suspicions. They had their beliefs, their thoughts. Well, you can't arrest someone simply because you believe they did something. You have to have tangible proof. And when they finally unearthed her remains, in that backyard decades later, they finally had their proof that DiAnne was dead. And eventually she got her justice. It's just you have to hope that he didn't hurt anyone else in the meantime. It doesn't sound like he is accused of any other murders or anything like that. The wife he had been married to after the fact, was still alive and well, so... But because of DiAnne's daughter's, Lori's, determination as an adult, after being threatened and abused for years about not coming forward, she finally got the courage to say what happened. And because of that, her mother DiAnne got the justice she very rightfully deserved. But that is it for this case, True Crime, Rooney, Dooney, Dingleberry Dongs. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, hello, my name is Mike. If you're new to my channel, I tell true crime stories here on YouTube. So please subscribe, give this video a like, leave a comment so more people will see it. Please hit the bell so you're notified of when I post videos, and please watch the videos all the way through if you could. Share the videos if you like. I also tell short form true crime stories over on TikTok. The link to my TikTok is in the link tree, which is in the description of this video below. I have a couple pages over there. Feel free to follow them if you like. I do post compilation videos of all my true crime short form cases from TikTok over here on YouTube once every month. Also in that link tree below, you will find my case list. The case list is getting close to 7,000 names. I pick my cases typically at random to cover, but if there's a case you want me to cover, just send me an email. My email is also listed down below. Just the name of the case, where it happened, and when it happened, and I'll add that name to my list. If it's just a case you just want me to cover just for, whatever reason, I'll get to it eventually, but like I said, I pick them at random. However, if you are a direct loved one to a murdered or missing individual, maybe they haven't gotten justice yet, or maybe you just want their story told. If you are a loved one, just let me know that in the email so I can make sure that is a priority. Otherwise, cases are just chosen randomly. But that is it for this video, and so until the next case, ta-ta for now, True Crime Rooney.